Hey there, Miss Mana is back with Chapter 10 of the Phantom Tollbooth. Chapter 10 is called A Colorful Symphony. So remember when we left off, Milo and the Humbug and Tok, the watchdog, are on their way to Digitopolis to find the king and try and rescue the princess's rhyme and reason. And along the way, they met Alec, who is the kid or the person who grows down instead of up. And they were traveling through the forest. As they ran, tall trees closed in around them and they arched gracefully toward the sky. The late afternoon sunlight leapt lightly from leaf to leaf, slid along branches and down trunks, and dropped finally to the ground in warm, luminous patches. A soft glow filled the air with the kind of light that made everything look sharp and clear and close enough to reach out and touch. Alec raced ahead, laughing and shouting, but soon encountered serious difficulties, for while he could always see the tree behind the next one, he could never see the next one itself, and was continually crashing into it. After several minutes of wildly dashing about, they all stopped for a breath of air. "I think we're lost," panted the Humbug, collapsing into a large berry bush. "Nonsense," shouted Alec from the high branch on which he sat. "Do you know where we are?" asked Milo. "Certainly," he replied. "We're right here on this very spot. Besides, being lost is never a matter of not knowing where you are. It's a matter of not knowing where you aren't, and I don't care at all about where I'm not." This was much too complicated for the bug to figure out, and Milo had just begun repeating it to himself when Alec said, "If you don't believe me," asked the giant, and he pointed to a small house tucked neatly between the two largest trees. Milo and Tok "If you don't believe me, ask the giant," he said. Milo and Tok walked to the door whose brass nameplate read simply, "The Giant," and knocked. "Good afternoon," said the perfectly ordinary sized man who answered the door. Does he look like a giant? No, not really. "Are you the giant?" asked Tok doubtfully. "To be sure," he replied proudly. "I'm the smallest giant in the world. What can I do for you?" "Are we lost?" asked Milo. "That's a difficult question," said the giant. "Why don't you go around back and ask the midget?" And he closed the door. They walked to the rear of the house, which looked exactly like the front, and knocked at the door, whose nameplate read, "The Midget." "How are you?" inquired the man, who looked exactly like the giant. Do they look exactly the same? Think so. "Are you the midget?" asked Tok again, with a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "Unquestionably," he answered. "I'm the tallest midget in the world. May I help you?" "Do you think we're lost?" repeated Milo. "That's a very complicated problem," he said. "Why don't you go around to the side and ask the fat man?" And he too quickly disappeared. The side of the house looked very much like the front and the back, and the door flew open the very instant they knocked. "How nice of you to come by!" exclaimed the man, who could have been the midget's twin brother. "You must be the fat man," said Tok, learning not to count too much on appearance. "The thinnest one in the world," he replied brightly. "But if you have any questions, I suggest you try the thin man on the other side of the house." Just as they suspected, the other side of the house looked the same as the front, the back, and the side. And the door again was answered by a man who looked precisely like the other three. What do you think? All four men look exactly the same. "What a pleasant surprise!" he cried happily. "I haven't had a visitor in as long as I can remember." "How long is that?" asked Milo. "I'm sure I don't know," he replied. "Now pardon me, I have to answer the door." "But you just did," said Tok. "Oh yes, I'd forgotten. Are you the fattest thin man in the world?" asked Tok. "Do you know one that's fatter?" he asked impatiently. "I think you're all the same man," said Milo empathetically. "Shh," he cautioned, putting his finger to his lips and drawing Milo closer. "Do you want to ruin everything? You see, to tall men, I'm a midget. To short men, I'm a giant. To the skinny ones, I'm the fat man. And to the fat ones, I'm a thin man. That way, I can hold 4 jobs at once. As you can see, though, I'm neither tall, nor short, nor fat, nor thin. In fact, I'm quite ordinary, but there are so many other ordinary men that no one asks their opinions about anything. Now, what is your question?" So it is, in fact, the same person. "Are we lost?" asked Milo once again. Said the man, scratching his head. I haven't had such a difficult question in as long as I can remember. Would you mind repeating it? It has slipped my mind. Milo asked the question again. My, the man mumbled. I know one thing for certain. It's much harder to tell whether you are lost than whether you were lost. For on many occasions, where you're going is exactly where you are. On the other hand, you often find that where you've been is not at all where you should have gone. And since it's much more difficult to find your way back from someplace you've never left, I suggest you go there immediately and then decide. If you have any more questions, please ask the giant. And he slammed his door and pulled down his shade. I hope you're satisfied, said Alec when they returned from the house. He bounced to his feet, bent down to awaken the snoring humbug, and started off, more slowly this time, in the direction of a large clearing. Do many people live here in the forest? Asked Milo as they trotted along together. Oh yes, they live in a wonderful city called Reality, he announced, smashing into one of the smaller trees and sending a cascade of nuts and leaves to the ground. It's right this way. In a few more steps, the forest opened before them, and off to the left, a magnificent metropolis, that's a big city, appeared. The rooftops shone like mirrors, the walls glistened with thousands of precious stones, and the broad avenues or streets were paved in silver. Is that it? Shouted Milo, running toward the shiny streets. Oh no, that's only illusions, said Alec. The real city is over there. What are illusions? Milo asked, for it was the loveliest city he'd ever seen. Illusions, explained Alec, are like mirages, and realizing that this didn't help much, he continued. And mirages are things that aren't really there, that you can't see very clearly. And how can you see something that isn't there? Yawned the humbug, who was now fully awake. Sometimes it's much simpler than seeing things that are, he said. For instance, if something is there, you can only see it with your eyes open. But if it isn't there, you can see it just as well with your eyes closed. That's why imaginary things are often easier to see than real ones. Then where is reality? Barked Talk. Right here, cried Alec, waving his arms. You're standing in the middle of Main Street. Right here, cried They looked around very carefully. Talk sniffed suspiciously at the wind, and the humbug gingerly stabbed his cane in the air. But there was nothing at all to see. It's really a very pleasant city, said Alec as he strolled down the street, pointing out several of the sights which didn't seem to be there, and tipping his cap to the passer-byers. There were great crowds of people rushing along with their heads down, and they all appeared to know exactly where they were going as they darted down and around the non-existent streets and in and out of missing buildings. Here's a picture of the people. I don't see any city, said Milo very softly. Neither do they, Alec remarked sadly. But it hardly matters, for they don't miss it at all. It must be very difficult to live in